around 12,000 years ago, people began moving out of Africa and settling in the Middle East, in Palestine. Before that time, the stratigraphic record in Palestine indicates that it was very sparsely populated. But these new people appeared, called Natufeans, and there's considerable argument about where they came from. The general assumption is that they came from the area that Maria Gimbutas calls Old Europe. But this is really based simply on the belief that they were so advanced that they couldn't possibly have come from anywhere else. When in fact, an analysis of the wall paintings of these people and an analysis of the pottery seems to indicate that they came from Africa, that these were African peoples. At first they settled under the lips of, under rock escarpments. This is exactly the settlement pattern that we see in the Tesseling Najjar Plateau in Algeria, where there are actually paintings on the rock walls dated to 7,000, 8,000 BC, where we see shamans with mushrooms sprouting out of their bodies, thousands of them. Now, this mushroom-using culture established itself in Palestine at Jericho. And Jericho, at its triumph, was the most advanced civilization in the world. The tower at Jericho was by all measures the most sophisticated culture of its time. Later, these same people settled at Çatalhöyük in southern Turkey. Çatalhöyük is 3,500 years in advance of any other civilization on Earth at that time. The chief investigator of the site, James Mallard, called it a premature flash of complexity and brilliance, and it disappeared mysteriously. The motifs may have been transferred to Crete, but as far as we can tell, that was the last vestige of this psychedelically motivated partnership society, and it was destroyed by the Kurgan invaders, the wheeled chariot people who came from north of the Black Sea with an entirely different psychology. You see, their psychology was shaped by the domestication of the horse, which was a permission for a raiding psychology, a psychology of nomadic plunder. While the domestication of cattle in Africa some 5,000 years before had created the opportunity for this goddess, mushroom, cattle kind of psychology to evolve. Now these people were living, the mushroom-using peoples of the ancient Middle East and of pre-desert Africa were living in a dynamic equilibrium with the environment. This was the Edenic state. I mean, if you read the story of Genesis carefully, it is clearly the story of a drug bust. It is clearly the story of a woman's transgressions, and Yahweh, walking in the garden, says to himself, if they eat of the tree, they will become as we are. There's no shilly-shallying about this. What was at stake here was whether or not human beings should claim a stake in Godhead. And the decision was made that they should not, and they were cast out of Eden, and an angel was set at the gate of Eden with a burning sword so that they could not find their way back. This is the story of centuries of continual drought, shattering the back of a partnership civilization that was at equilibrium in Central Africa 15 to 25,000 years ago. Now we are the sad inheritors of this situation. The mysteries survived in a very attenuated form for several millennia in Crete, and Crete then became the bastion of the mystical impulse in Hellenistic religion. At the mysteries at Eleusis, for example. The ancient authors said what was practiced secretly at Eleusis was practiced openly at Gnosis. And there's considerable evidence that the mushroom cult may have persisted a long time in Crete. These puzzling so-called aniconic pillars that are erected in the center of many of the rooms of the palace at Knossos seem very much to argue that there was a memory of this ancient religion. The linear B tallies on opium use yielded such high numbers when translated that the early assumption was that the glyph for opium must be the glyph for wheat. Now it's understood that this is not the case, and it is true that the twilight of Minoan religion was an opiated twilight. My belief is, you see, that our proclivity for drug use, this itch that we can never scratch, which really places us in a completely different category from the rest of animal organization. And I'm perfectly aware that elephants intoxicate themselves on papayas and all that malarkey. But those animals that have preference for intoxicants usually prefer one or two. We have scoured the biosphere for drugs of all sorts. And a drug that was used 200 years ago by 5,000 or 6,000 people can probably be bought within minutes if you walk out of this building, because the news spreads. We have an absolute obsession with the alteration of consciousness. And I believe it's because we are in a state of, call it trauma, denial. We as a species are the victims of a dysfunctional childhood. We were torn from that which gave life meaning by climatological and cultural factors which forced us then into the nightmare of history. And it is from that nightmare that we must awaken, or the lethal momentum of egocentrism is going to shove us right over the edge. The ego is like a calcareous tumor on the personality of each of us. This tumor must be psycholytically removed. It must be dissolved. Not that we must have no ego. After all, when you take someone to dinner, you want to know whose mouth to put food in. But the big ego that flowers out beyond the operational need to identify with a single body is an entirely maladaptive response. And we're sick with it, through and through. No less a bastion of conservative and establishment thinking than Arthur Koestler. In his book, The Ghost in the Machine, finally concludes, we have to have a drug which inhibits the territorial impulse. That was when the territorial impulse was a big buzzword. But what he meant was, we have to interfere with the ego. It's completely unnecessary. It's a burden to everyone who has it, and the collective impact of it is absolutely thanatoptic. So the archaic revival is an impassioned and unconsciously driven reaching back into time. No, the Renaissance won't do it. No, the Greek ideals are not sufficient. No, pharaonic Egypt isn't enough. No, until finally we reach the brink of the last glaciation. And there we find people who are functioning. Their fertility levels, their supply and demand relationship with their environment, all this is working.